Hey, I'm Taylor Dorsett, and this is the Professional Technical Interviewee. Technical interviews are hard, and every company does them differently. On this show, I interview engineering leaders to see what they look for in technical candidates, and then they perform a real technical interview with me. I hope you enjoy.
Zach, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Doing very well. Thanks so much for being here on a early Friday morning.
Oh, I appreciate it. I'm always up and moving, and Friday's a great time to just chat with people.
Yeah, great. Well, I guess today is Zach Lome, currently the senior software engineering manager at Amount, based out of Chicago. Anything else I missed? I know you've been there for quite a number of years, right? I think close
Yeah,
to 7.
I've been there for it'll be 7 years in 2 weeks actually. So the anniversary is coming up, which is really fun because as the company has evolved and changed, people go on to other projects, people move to different teams, and so I'm like number 3 or 4 in seniority in product development
Wow.
space right now. So a lot of people look up to me just because I've been around and I've seen us grow from a really tiny startup where I was in a tiny conference room with like 5 other people on a shared desk to like obviously COVID. Our company split at one point, so like
Right,
half the
right.
company went to Avant, half the company became Amount, which is obviously where I am now. So yeah, like just seeing it and having been here a while really helps know what we're doing.
And we've had Umang, who's no longer at Amount, but he was on the podcast previously, and then Sean Walters, who was
Walters.
at Active Campaign at the time, is now at Amount. So,
That's right. I actually
small.
report to Sean. And
Oh,
actually,
great.
you just interviewed Nate Reynolds, who was at Avant back in 2015 and 2016. I actually worked with him, I was going to say.
I
So,
love
yeah,
it.
you'll find us everywhere. If you interview in Chicago, you're going to hit some Avantis and Amounties.
Absolutely. The Rails almost, it does feel like everything in Chicago, the Rails routes through Avant, Amount, or Nova at one point, right?
Yep.
Just about everything. Yeah. Cool. Well, can you share a little bit about your role at the company and kind of your team and what you do?
Absolutely. So right now I'm the lead/manager of the technical architecture team. I report to the VP of engineering, who, as you said, that's Sean. So my team is responsible for kind of designing code, establishing best practices for deploying and using code patterns and services, and how we break up our services and tooling and how those things interact with each other. So pretty much everything related to architecture from the very low level in terms of like literal like performant
Mhm.
system use to the high level of how do these services talk to each other.
Great. And
Yeah.
do you're actually managing individuals as well?
So I'm both managing individuals and I'm contributing both on a consultant and even a code basis. I shouldn't be writing code. Everyone is telling me stop writing code, but I'm a programmer at heart. I always have been and I always will be. And if they don't want me to write code, they will pretty much have to fire me. So please don't fire me, Sean, but like I love code. So but yeah,
Uh,
I'm managing 4 people right now. So
Nice.
not
I
a
love
big
it.
team, but
And it's traditionally a Rails stack, but is there anything else specifically your team uses or anything interesting to describe?
yeah, so it's still primarily Ruby on Rails, although we're actually moving away from the Rails stuff. There's actually a new project a new service we're going to be starting next week that I'm targeting building in either Rhoda or Sinatra as the
Ooh.
framework, or even just raw rack, because the goal is performant over everything else. And as you know, Rails is a pretty bloated service. So we're kind of investigating that, but also, the company has always written a little bit in Python, a little bit in
Mm.
TypeScript. We've expanded our use of Golang. When you talked to Umang last year, he mentioned that DXP was doing a lot of Golang. Well, that actually did filter into product development just a little bit. And so we have some workflows in our newest service that we're building, or that we've been building for a while, that are actually all written in Go. So we're very slowly expanding out. We've also we recently acquired a company called Linear FT, who's now Amount Small Business, and they are a Java shop. And so we've also been looking at ways and patterns to incorporate Java, although that's still very much an ongoing process.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think it's always interesting as a company grows and you see, okay, this makes sense. And that's where I feel like the Go community is pretty large in Chicago now, where a lot of it came out of someone building smaller projects and then it kind of just expanded within the company. But the Sinatra route's interesting. That's what Nate was talking about there. They were a Sinatra shop for, I think, for that reason, right? They wanted something that was a little bit lighter weight when they got started. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. Can you share a little bit about your pathway into technology and how you got into the software development field?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like a lot of people, it was video games, it was NES, right? Like I've wanted to be a video game programmer since I was like 6 years old. Pretty much the second I was given an NES, I was like, I need to make this stuff. So we had an old IBM 386. I took the QBasic. It came with the QBasic packages installed with a couple default games, and I would I would change the constants and the values inside of like the tank game. And when we did get like a Windows machine, the first thing I did was search for game creation systems, and there was 3 of them: ZZT, Megazooks, and it was like Onarpg. It was like, oh no, not another RPG game creation
Yeah, yeah.
system. And so I would write like scripts and languages in those. So I've literally been doing it pretty much my entire life. So
Nice.
it was a no-brainer. College, programming. High school, any electives, if they could be around programming. So I was going on the game creation route, and then in 2006 I interviewed actually at Volition Inc., which made Red Faction and Saints Row at the time, and did fairly well in those interviews. We might talk about that more a little bit later, but I ended up not getting the job for some reasons, which again I can get into later. And I did some research afterwards, and I'm like, oh, the game industry is terrifying. Maybe I won't do that. And I talked to one of my friends who recommended a job for me, which was in the web tech space, and I just never looked back.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, can you share a little about the first interview experience? Because I know a lot of people are in similar shoes, right? Like they love game development, and then they start to
Yeah.
get into it, and maybe they go, maybe not, right? Or maybe this industry isn't quite what I thought it would be.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so this was actually my senior year in college, or my super senior year, and I had been taking game creation classes, and one of my friends said, like, you're not good at interviewing. You've never interviewed, you don't know what you're even talking about. So I just applied on a lark, literally in the middle of work one day, and they ended up contacting me back because they have contacts at Illinois State University, where I went to school. The interview itself went fairly well. There was one embarrassing moment, which I know you'll want to ask about later, where I did very poorly, but overall, I answered their questions really well. It was a panel style interview that went the whole day. We had a lunch break at the restaurant that was at the bottom floor of the building, and I was getting along very well with all of the developers. The panel style interview was like, there was a technical challenge where I had to fix not quite working code. There was a design challenge, which was my favorite question ever, and I actually introduced it into everywhere that I've worked, which is what I call the elevator problem. I don't know if you've heard of this problem or interacted with it
Yeah.
before, but basically it's like, given the basic concept of an elevator, how would you design, what algorithmically would you do for an elevator? And you can get as technical or non-technical as you want in terms of stuff, but we did it on a whiteboard. There was some design, like graphics work about occlusion, and some basic culture fit questions, right? But it was like, I think 5 people or 6 people in total interviewed me, and at the end I was talking to the CEO, and he's like, what's your expected salary range? Like, what kind of other work have you done? And he's like, you're still in college, but I understand you're about to leave soon. When can you start? And I said, in 6 months, because it's 2 more months till the end of the year, and then I'm going to be studying abroad for 4 months. I'm going to Japan. I can't not go to Japan. I've already paid for this stuff. So I'm really sorry. I actually didn't expect to get this far. I can start in May. And he's like, cool, we'll put your resume on file, and if we need you, we'll contact you again. And obviously I never got contacted again, because no one is going to wait 6 months for a fresh grad. Yeah. And then so when I got back from Japan, I'm like, what is going on? And we started hearing about all the EA. In the meantime, while I was in Japan, the EA story had come out about like the EA wife, and I was like, oh, okay. Volition seemed really cool, though. I'm not saying that Volition was anything like that at all, right? I don't want to speak ill of that company, and also this was 16 years ago. So could be a very different company now. They were really neat, and I got to see Red Faction Guerrilla 2 before it was released. So
Nice.
very cool. But yeah, I mean, my favorite problem and my least favorite problem both came out of that interview.
Well, it sounds like a good experience in the, you know, early stages of your career, basically going through that process and seeing some success, but also, you know, maybe some adversity to work through in an interview process.
Yes, it definitely helps establish a baseline of what I would end up expecting of people that I interview in terms of what matters and what doesn't.
Yeah. Great. Can you share a little bit about how you found Amount and kind of what led you to this job?
Yeah, it's not going to be a very exciting story, unfortunately. Basically, I was working at Bank of America at the time, and I was feeling really bad imposter syndrome just because of struggling to understand the subject matter expertise. Like
Mm,
when I was doing platform work, I had no problem, but there was a lot of finance math involved, and
mm,
I had trouble understanding model vol cubes and yield curves, and that was literally my job. So I'm like, I just need somewhere else. So I just started to responding to recruiters who had been hounding me nonstop, and I ended up picking Avant because they sounded like a reasonable, cool startup. They weren't going to cut my pay relative to what I was making at Bank of America. They had good bonuses. Everyone was really friendly and nice. And I was like, yeah, I did well. You know, they offered me a job, which is always good. But it was a good experience because I was only writing in Python at the time, right? Avant was a Ruby and Rails shop. I had never written or dealt with Ruby before, and they were very accommodating of that, right? They
mm.
let me try in Ruby because I tried to, prep work and study. But when I started to fund it, like write in Python instead. I'm like, cool, I'm gonna do this in Python instead. Which is something that I've also carried on. But yeah, it was that sense of openness of like your voice will matter.
Mm.
For me, Bank of America, one of 10,000 ish programmers across the globe in a team of 20 people, most of whom have 10 plus years experience at the company. To go from that, where like my boss's boss didn't even know our team existed, to a company of like, at the time, I think 50 devs
Yeah.
being told explicitly, your voice matters. Like your opinions of what good code looks like matters. I'm like, boom, let's do it.
Yeah. We
That's
probably
why I
got out
stayed.
at the right time too, because I know a lot of folks who, you know, they started Bank of America, and once you're there for a handful of years, that hourly rate goes up and up, that salary goes up and up, and then it's tough to leave, right? There's
Yeah.
probably a lot of folks in similar shoes who go, it doesn't make sense to leave, right? You
Yeah,
got
I
out
was
at the
still
right
young
time.
at the time. If I'll definitely say if I'd had my two children that I have now back then, probably would have stayed. But
Yeah.
I was still, young. So it always makes it easier to leave when you're young.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe a little bit less risk adverse, right?
Yeah.
Have you done any technical interviews lately for your team internally?
Um, Good thing you mentioned internally. So, we've been actually on a hiring freeze for the company as a whole, but I've actually grown my team from no people to 4 people, and
Mm,
like I said, in the past 3 months. There's no interview process because we're hiring internally from other teams, people that I've already worked with. Again, having been here for 7 years, like I literally interviewed and hired a couple of these people, or I already managed them in one
mm,
like space or another. But I have kind of built the hypothetical structure for how an interview would go. And there's 3 bullet points that I'm really targeting specifically for technical architecture in particular, besides subject matter expertise,
mhm,
right? We need people who are aware of what our code base currently is to be able to envision the future of it. First is passion for documentation and communication,
mm,
because so much of what our job is not writing code, but actually consulting and helping other people write better code, right? Understand like you can't do this stuff synchronously in a loop. You have to break it up into like queues. Queues
yeah.
is the right strategy. Here's our documentation on queues, right? So that's like a really important thing that these people can come in and say, here's what you do, and the other devs understand. The second thing is a good understanding of how to break down complex problems into manageable parts,
Mm,
because when we are writing code, it's not like we're going into the service and fixing the code. What we're trying to do is focus on, hey, we've established that best practices for queuing is to use ActiveMQ, for example. But the
mhm,
libraries for ActiveMQ all suck, and we're trying to do it in this really weird place. Let's build a gem that makes it so it's really easy to write ActiveMQ, right? Or say like, hey,
Interesting.
we know that we have this scalability problem because we're writing millions of records to this database every month. What can we do to make it easier for the devs? What tooling can we build? And what are all of the pieces that are needed to make this happen? And so being able to break down big problems into little problems is the other part. And the other thing is strong opinions weakly held. This is a phrase that one of my superiors used to say all the time. And I love it because you can't be in architecture if you don't really care about the quality of your services, right? Architecture is entirely about building strong foundations, having straight scaffolding, to carry on with the analogy of regular architecture, right? And so much of it is being passionate about like we should use parallelism, we should be using separate services, we should be using a NoSQL store instead of a relational database for XYZ uses, right? But the weekly held part is equally important because everyone looks up to us. Like we are consulting with every other dev in the company, and sometimes the facts on the ground don't line up with our opinions. I have one dev who's a brilliant developer. She's phenomenal. She's really, really, really into functional programming. And so all of her designs have kind of a functional programming flavor, which is great most of the time. But there are use cases where it doesn't make sense exactly. And so talking with her, it's what I like about her on the team is that she'll be like, okay, yeah, I thought we could use functional programming, but I see that we really need to have some classes that manage some state for this. Fine. Right. And if she wasn't like that, if she wasn't able to give up those opinions to like give the best solutions for the specific problems, then she wouldn't be a good fit. So basically it's all about like, how do you react to the facts on the ground? How good are you at simplifying the problem into space, and then how good are you at communicating your simplification of the problem so that they understand the full scope?
Yeah, I
The
like
three
that a
things
lot.
I'm looking for.
That's really interesting. I haven't thought about like what is like really important as a technical architect, especially as the company continues to grow. I often think of like making the decision, but not necessarily the documentation part of it and the communication part of it, because if you could have the best solution in the world, but if it requires people to talk to you every time or some not great process, right, to get that information, then obviously you're still the bottleneck, right? It doesn't really necessarily
Yeah.
solve anything.
Yeah.
So that's
I've had to
great.
spend a lot of time making like UML diagrams, and then when people are like, what, okay, but how do I write that into code? Drafting charts that like and sample proofs of concept just to be like, here's what I mean when I say
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
I'll tell you what, though, there's nothing better than when I'm digging through some piece of our back end where I'm like, I just vaguely understand what I'm even trying to do, and then I hit this thing. I'm like, great, I found where I need to be. And I'm like, oh, there's actual documentation that is helpful in here, right? Like this was written 4 years ago by someone who's like a architect, right? Like this is great.
Yeah.
Really makes
Yeah.
life a lot easier.
We always try to put README files at like every folder level of all of our services so that everybody knows what's going on when
Yeah,
they have to dig through code.
I love it. I think you also mentioned in the past you've been a part of like helping design the interview process.
That's correct. Yeah. So I what was it, back in 2017, I think it was 2017 or maybe 2018. There was an architecture team for a short while. It wasn't technical architecture. It wasn't super well defined. It was kind of weird actually. But one of our roles was essentially onboarding and establishing the information flow, right? Again, it was a communication problem. And so a lot of it was working with the VP of engineering at the time to figure out how we could identify like really good devs. And our interview process itself didn't change very much, but I was responsible for rewriting a lot of the questions we were asking for the code writing portion and the code reading portion in particular, and building out those same questions in a couple different spaces. So there was a code smells challenge that had been written, but it was only in TypeScript because it was written by a front end dev. So I rewrote that same thing in Ruby and in Python because we try to be language agnostic in our interviews and go with whatever language the dev is familiar with, and having more questions in more languages makes that easier. I rewrote the language for our big code writing problem, which I ended up actually doing that question, I want to say like 150-ish times, maybe
Yeah.
closer to 200, honestly. Because I was interviewing sometimes 2 times a day for like a 9-month period.
Wow.
Like for like almost a year, I was like the person doing code writing interviews, and we had other people come in and partner with me at times. There were times where I would switch which question I did, but I was always there. And then obviously, so the way our interviews worked is we had a like 5-person panel. We would do code reading, code writing, an architecture question, which we had a couple, again, like rotating sets of questions on how you would design a system, a like history and project, basically like a walkthrough of the resume, and then we would do like a generic like culture fit, which was just like the director of backend being like, hey, what do you like to do, like,
Yeah.
right, kind of stuff. And then we would all come together and say like, what did we like, what didn't we like, do all of our opinions and experiences line up? Are we all enthusiastic, or are a couple people very enthusiastic, a couple people don't care?
Mm.
And it basically figure out the results there. But I was there every step of the way, tweaking the questions, tweaking the language, and digging deeper and deeper into like how people's responses were proxies for the real question that I wanted to get at, which was how would they do as a programmer at Avant slash what became Amount?
Yeah.
Because that's what actually matters. Not are you good at code? Anybody who is a good programmer can become good at writing code, junior, senior, whatever. But being a programmer is more than just writing code. It's working in a particular, agile mindset. It is being able to dig through code to find the root cause of bugs. It is being able to handle a code review from both sides, doing the review and being reviewed, walking through your own code and explaining it, as well as writing the code, understanding why certain decisions were made, feeling free to challenge those decisions, right? You can't really, in my opinion, be a senior developer until you're able to defend from like a logical and strategic standpoint why you implemented something a particular way.
Yeah.
And so the interview, the code writing, that's why I did the same question. One of the rules that I established was I would do the same question for every developer, regardless of scale and scope, so that I could really see who was answering the question in the strategic, clever, thought through way, and who was just flying by the seat of their pants.
Yeah. Interesting. And I'm sure at that scale too. I mean, when you're talking about hundreds of interviews, you learn a lot and see a lot of patterns. I mean, was there, you mentioned what you're looking for within your architecture team now, and kind of making sure that you're looking for like people who work well at Innova, but at Avant
at the time, which became Amount. Yeah, I know, it's fun. It's
the
super
cardinal
fun.
sin.
Yeah. I'm even wearing the Amount shirt.
There
so
you go.
I got
Is there
today.
any particular trends or traits that you saw from those individuals that you thought showed that they would be successful when working at Amount?
Absolutely. So I can think back to a couple instances that ended up not working well, even though they were senior programmers in past, which I think was almost more illustrative than who did well. And a lot of juniors actually, whose answers were not necessarily very good, but who exhibited the traits that I was looking for, who did phenomenally well. So for the latter, let's do the simple one. The programmers who in the code writing part of the interview communicated their thought processes clearly to me while they were doing it, and noticed their mistakes as soon as they were relevant, did better, right? The people that actually were paying attention to the code they wrote and said, oh, this isn't going to work, let me go back a step. Those people universally did better than the people who just bulleted, like pushed their way through and then needed to be prompted to be like, you're not getting the right result, why aren't you getting the right result? Because I would always give like, question type feedback of like, well, why don't you think this is working? Does this make sense for tracking balance? Does this make sense for tracking payments? Like I tweaked the language of this question like 15 different times to make it perfect for people, because it was everybody. So like so juniors almost universally would make the same mistakes when they started. This is a question about like tracking credits and debits on a card basically, and then being able to calculate how much is owed. It's fairly straightforward as a question, but you would see almost all of them just use a scaler to track balance to start with if they were juniors. Seniors would be a little bit more cognizant of the requirement right at the top of the question. You need to keep track of credits and debits, right? Like I explicitly say that, and juniors would miss that. But the juniors that noticed that they missed that and went back did better. Conversely, what I found is like the Rockstar 10x programmers, like they would bullet, they would solve the question in like 20 minutes or 30 minutes. We have an hour for it, and there's like extra credit questions on top. And sometimes I only had a couple people get it, but there was this one dev in particular who just knocked out everything immediately. I'm like, wow, you're really freaking good. This is awesome. But like he was so confident and so sure, and he wrote the code and he was done. And when we got him in, he barely did anything. He was like, I'm too smart to work on these problems. And he was like really pushy about how stuff needed to be done. And he ended up breaking one of our core storage systems for like audit logging for one of our systems. And it was like a nightmare dealing with him because I couldn't get a read on his thought processes when he was going through. He was clearly technically proficient, but he was a terrible programmer because he didn't know how to collaborate or cooperate with his project manager. So that's really it. It's about the meta skills. It's not about the programming. It's about, can you understand the logic of programming, and can you understand the logic of breaking down a problem into solvable parts?
I think that's be good for a lot of folks to hear too, because the people always think, oh, I have to learn this skill better, right? Which is coding whatever your preferred language is, right? And that's certainly a piece of it, but that is the stuff you learn in the job and from being in it every day. They're the soft skills, like the stuff outside of that actually I think help you grow in the long run, right? Like you said, you can't be a senior developer unless you can do that. You might be really good at React, but unless you can do that, it's be difficult for you to move above a level where you're just contributing code, right?
Yeah.
If you can do anything from an architecture perspective, any type of real technical leadership, you have to have those skills so you can actually help others do that as well, right?
Yeah. Right. Like a lot of the people that become very good at writing code typically become very good at like one particular type of pattern or one particular type of problem. Like, again, like, oh, I'm really good at building these React and Redux spaces. But if you ask them, okay, but you've got to go into the back end now and figure out this, like, again, like some sort of like message queue system that's recoverable even if the job fails in the middle, using a dependency injection system where the configuration is stored in Vault, like how would you build that? And they just freeze up because it's out of their wheelhouse. Whereas if you understand the design patterns around parallelism, around message queuing and pub sub, if you understand the broad concepts of what's going on, you can come to a better solution.
Well, let me turn the tables here a little bit. In the past, when you've been in technical interviews, how do you feel you did? You mentioned the one from early in your career that went pretty well. Do you think you're good at them, bad at them, somewhere in between? Depends on the interview.
I think that I generally do very well because I know what people are looking for, right? It is that most of the time it's the communication skills and it's the general expertise skills, right? I know how to program, I know how to answer your problem space, right? Since I've been in finance for so long, right? Bank of America, Avant, I understand a lot of the finance problems that you're trying to solve, which are very different from the game design problems. So if I'm going out of my subject matter expertise, I admit that like that's something I need to grow on. And people like to hear, yeah, I'm not perfect at this. I'll grow on this, right? So I think I tend to do pretty well in interviews, quite honestly. But it's not like I've done a lot of them. The only recent interview I did was when Basecamp announced, DHH said, hey, we're hiring for a director of engineering, base salary $343,000. I'm like, yeah, I'll apply for that.
Sure,
I got through the interview process, but no, I did not, in fact, become the director of engineering at Basecamp.
Sure.
So I didn't do well enough there.
Well, I'm curious, do you have any type of system you use to break down questions? Or let's say you're in a position where you go, okay, I don't have an immediate solution for this, right? What do you do?
I think I kind of covered it a little bit when I was talking about what I'm really trying to observe. So I wouldn't call it a system so much as like a set of arbitrary heuristics, which is one of the advantages, right, of a panel of interviewers is everybody's going to have their own way of approaching how a person did, and having lots of different people means you're more likely to converge on like a proper solution. But yeah, so for me, generally, it's really about identifying as closely as I can those things that I've kind of applied. Like how much attention do you pay to the questions themselves, and how much care and attention do you pay to the things that I and my partner interviewer, if there is one, are saying about the questions or asking about your code? Basically, attention to detail is one of those like meta skills, but especially in programming and when you're looking and dealing with code is super important, right? Because one line can make the difference between working and not working. So attention to detail. When you run into a problem or design flaw or confusion issue, how quickly do you notice and how do you go about clarifying or resolving it? Again, that iterative strategy I found is a much more effective strategy than just being right every time.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for, 2 decades now. I'm not right the first time, like 9 times out of 10. So people that are more, like I said that earlier, right? People that are more cognizant of their flaws, who are reviewing their code as they go through it, tend to do better. How much prep work do people do? In the sense of like, it could be writing out the code and revising it. It could be planning or sketching or doing TDD. It could be just rereading the question out loud. But I found generally that people that are measured and thoughtful tend to do better. So I pay attention to how often the person is stopping themselves and taking a moment to breathe. Um, and again, it's that whole like flying by the seat of your pants versus the other thing. There's a phrase I say at work all the time. It drives people nuts that I keep saying it. It's measure twice, cut once, right? It's very architecture philosophy, but it does pay dividends, and something you can see in a code writing interview. And then the last is how good are you communicating out your thought processes and your strategies, and most importantly, your expectations, right? If a project manager gives you a ticket that has like vague results and you just kind of deliver whatever, and no one involved is communicating clearly what they think the result should be, it becomes much more difficult to get a good outcome. And again, those are the sorts of things you can all evaluate in an interview. So it's not a system. There's no, like, I don't have like a ranked number points, but like I'm always looking at those bullet points and writing notes about how their answers or their behaviors match or fail against those points.
Yeah. That's great. I think that's very helpful. And again, echoes what you've been talking about, right? Like a lot of these things are things you can improve without just, you don't have to crank out just hours in React to get better at these things, right? These are the things you can practice and work on outside of just writing code.
That's right.
Do you have, I mean, I think these are all good things. Do you have any other tips or advice for folks who are going into interviews? Maybe they haven't done technical interviews in a while, or they don't like them. Any advice for folks outside of those things?
I'm just going to be, again, repeating myself over and over and over. Communicate. Yeah, that's it. Like I said, even in interviews where I'm not in the same domain that I should be an expert in, I just say, honestly, hey, this isn't really what I do today. This is not what I know super well, but here's something I do know, right? I always say, here's what I think is the problem. Here's what I think is the solution. Here's why I think it. That level of detail helps the interviewer understand you better. So much more. Like if you write bad code, but you can walk me through that code, that's going to be more valuable. Or if you're doing like a non-technical like architecture challenge and you don't quite know, like they're like, oh, do you want to use a DB, like a NoSQL or a relational DB, but you've never interacted with NoSQL. You don't actually know how NoSQL works. You don't know any NoSQL libraries, which has happened to me, by the way, in terms of me interviewing other people where I ask about that and they have no clue. Just saying like, okay, I don't know what a NoSQL store is. Can you describe it to me? Are you allowed to explain that to me? Right? Like literally be open and communicative with your interviewer. That's it.
Yeah.
Ask questions, but be honest too. Don't pretend like you know something when you don't. We will find out.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a hesitancy from a lot of folks when they're in interviews to say like, oh, I don't really know this thing, because they're like, if someone's asking me about it, I obviously should know. Right. But just being upfront about that, it does help, because sometimes you get a great explainer, right? Someone can say, oh, here's all the details, and you have an interesting conversation where you can actually build off of, right?
Exactly.
Versus you say, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that, and then they ask you more questions and clearly you're not, right? And then it's just kind of either an X or a question mark at best, right? Kind of on that point in the interview. So
right, exactly. Like the worst thing that happens if they ask you a question about some technical specific thing that you don't know is that they really do expect you to know those things and you don't, and you would have a terrible time working at the job and you shouldn't get that job anyways. Like, I hate to say it, sometimes you interview for a job that's not a good fit for you, and you got to be
Totally.
comfortable with that idea. So like, just be honest, always be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any different advice or additional advice for folks who might be early career? Maybe this is their first or second job search.
Yes. I mean, want to repeat really quickly what I'd said before about like, admit what you don't know. But
Mm,
second, I think the other thing is you're allowed to hand wave solutions and just be like, hey, I'm hand waving this because I want to, like, if I have time, I'll get to the details and I'll
mm,
figure it out, but it would take me a longer time. So being comfortable with hand waving. And then the second thing is really do your best to communicate the idea that that you care about investing in yourself,
mm,
growing as a developer and a programmer. Because when you're hiring for a junior or someone who's right out of college, you're not hiring someone we know you're not going to be a good coder. Like, that's fine. But we want you to become a good coder. And ideally, we want you to become a good coder fast. And the only way that that happens is if you care about what you want to learn about. You have to show your passion.
mm.
Show your passion and show that your passion is about growing your abilities and capabilities in yourself. That's really important to get across and make clear to the interviewer is like, yeah, I know I only know some Ruby, but I really am passionate about scalability. I'm really passionate about your subject matter space. Finance is a really fascinating problem, or game development. I love that's the game development has no shortage of passion, but like, there are definitely people who just are trying to like apply because they're like, I can knock it out or whatever, or this seems really popular. And we don't, those people don't grow as well. And especially for juniors, you got to show that your passion is with yourself, not necessarily like, it's good to have it for the space or for the company, but like, it has to be in yourself because we're going to be investing time in you and we want to see that investment reflected.
Yeah. Do you have advice on good ways to show that in an interview? Obviously, you can talk about things you're doing, skills you're working on or courses you're taking. Anything else that you might advise?
That's kind of a tricky question. It depends a lot on what interview question you're being asked. If I'm doing the code writing question, right, it's going to be a lot harder to communicate what your passions are. Although I always leave room at the end for Q&A. Like,
Mhm.
it's like usually like 50 to 55 minutes and then 5 to 10 at the end to just talk. So there's like a little slice in there. But again, like, if it's about the history one or the culture fit, that's your time to just explain and talk and say like, hey, I'm really interested in XYZ thing. Do you do
Mm,
XYZ thing? I know that, or like, even in the code writing, if you're like, I don't know this problem, but this, like, I was reading about an article about this, right? It's
mm,
it's it's not about your bona fide so much as like, what have you done or shown, or what will you do? Honestly, sending a letter after the interview within like a day of like, hey, I checked out these articles you mentioned in the interview, or hey, I watched some videos, this is really fascinating stuff, I'm going to start a project. So like, I know it seems like overkill, but that stuff is always appreciated too. It is hard to show sometimes, though, I'll admit it.
I agree with the follow up, right? Like I think early on I got through a lot of interviews I probably shouldn't have because someone mentioned something and then I went, oh, I actually went and looked this up, right? And if I have time, you don't always have time, but if
Yeah.
I have time, great. Can I slap something together that shows I didn't just read the article, I actually internalized at least some of it, right?
Yeah.
Or taking the problem that we worked on, if I didn't finish it, then going and making a replit where it's like, oh, here's
Yes.
the last little bit
I
of that
had a
code,
couple
right?
devs do that where they would, email me a couple hours later saying, hey, I know we didn't finish the problem in the interview, but I sat down and I finished it now because it's really interesting. I love that. I always love that. I'm always going to give you positive marks for like engaging with the problem beyond the interview itself.
It's good best practice because there's a decent chance you'll see a similar problem in the future. Right? So you should
Yeah.
probably know how to figure it out. Oh, great. Well, before we move into the break, I know you mentioned earlier an embarrassing moment in the interview. Is there any horrible interview experiences you want to share or embarrassing experiences that people can
Absolutely.
relate to?
So first, I'm going to do one that I was interviewing, so it wasn't embarrassing for me, and then I'll do the one that I felt like mortified by. So the first is one of the way our interview process is, before they get to the panel of interviewees, we do a phone screener, which is like
Mhm.
fizz buzz level, right? Like, can you write code? Do you understand code? And I was
Yeah.
talking to this person online. We have CoderPad set up, and I get through the problem, and he kind of hems and haws for like 6 or 7 minutes and doesn't really, like, he writes some code that doesn't work. And then he disconnects, and it looks like a disconnect, and I'm very generous in my opinion of what's happening. So I'm like, oh no, he disconnected. So I call him back and I don't get an answer. I'm like, oh, he must be having some sort of like phone problems. All right, I'll call him back again. I call him back again like a couple minutes later, and he's like, I don't think I'm gonna do this job. And I'm like, huh? And he's like, yeah, I don't think I can do this. Bye. And he just hangs up. And like his resume had him as like a mid-level developer. He's like, I have years of experience writing code, and he like literally couldn't answer like a basic for loop. So I don't know what was going on, but I was like, this is the most awkward string. Like those 5 minutes where he was just like, dot each. Wait, no, I want to do a for loop. I'm like, well, it's Ruby, oh, okay, how each, like it was literally not even the right language of code. It was very weird. So that was like
Peter Evans, who's a past guest, used to say they always gave out FizzBuzz, and people used to be like, why are you giving me this question? He's like, we call it FizzBuzz the Destroyer, because regularly people hit it. And I do think it's a great, like, just making sure, okay, is this person, you should be able to do this a handful of minutes, right? If you can't, then something is misaligned, right? And I think that's a nice screener question.
You got to have a screener question. And then so for me, it was back at the Volition interview. Like I said, there was a technical challenge where I was seated in front of incomplete code and asked to complete it. Well, what that code was like, it was like a Windows graphic library where they had a circle and a square. And what had been implemented is you could drag either of the items. They said implemented so that whenever the two intersect, a little text box comes up, which is really basic crap for video game design. But the thing is, like I said, I was in my game programming classes at the time. It had taken me like 2 weeks just to figure out how to get like a compass UI element to point the right direction. I am garbage at geometry, like matrix math, vector math, like I failed geometry in high school. So I'm like, and I did the one thing that I said you should never do, which is why I say you never do it. I just sat there. I just was like, just looking at the code for like 6 or 7 minutes, and with these two people standing above me, waiting for me to do something, and the pressure got to be too much. And I was like, I don't know the algorithms or like the math to figure this out. I can't do this. I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. And I was like, the interview's freaking over now. I was so embarrassed. I was sorry. And I was just like, oh God. And you know what happened when I said this, I don't know how to do this, is they said, well, we can give you the basic equation. Why don't you just hack at the code for a while and see what you can get done in the next 20 minutes? And so they gave me like the actual, tangent of like from center to center or whatever, like, the rate. I don't remember the actual thing because again, this was 16 years ago and I'm still bad at geometry. But the point is, I was actually able to get it to work at the end because they gave me that info, because I admitted I didn't know. But those 7 minutes, again, nothing is worse in an interview than 7 minutes of silence. Never, ever, ever just sit there, please. It feels terrible for you, and it feels terrible for the interviewer too. I know those two people standing over me were like, oh boy.
Yeah. Well, and probably so happy when you actually said something, right? Because they don't want to butt in until, I don't know, maybe you're working on the perfect solution up there, or maybe you're completely lost, right?
Well, that's the thing is, if I'm working on the perfect solution up there, I should be able to say like, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. Here's right. And I couldn't. I mean, I had nothing. My brain blanked. I froze real bad. And so I learned from failing so miserably that like actually failure is not the worst thing that can happen for a number of reasons, but also like it's okay. But like, oh my gosh, I was like terrified because I'm like, crap, the one thing I knew I had to study and then failed to prepare for was exactly the question they asked, was geometry.
Oh, it's a classic first interview experience. I love it.
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's take a break here, and then we come back. We'll move into the technical portion. All right.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you for watching the first half of the Professional Technical Interviewee. The technical interview will be released 1 week from this episode, so be sure to subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. New episodes are released on the first 4 Thursdays of each month. Find us on YouTube at youtube.com/Taylor Dorsett, or on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. And remember, keep practicing.